second talk that will be delivered by Professor David Bellinger. Professor Bellinger is Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School and Professor of Environmental Health at Harvard School of Public Health. He is also a Senior Research Associate in Neurology and a Senior Research Associate in Psychiatry at the Children's Hospital Boston. He edited a textbook entitled Human Development Neurotoxicology. And he is currently president of the International Society for Children's Health and the Environment. He has served as a member of several committees of ETA, CDC, and STDR, as well as served as an advisor to the WHO Joint Expert Committee on Food Safety and chairperson to WHO's guideline on the prevention or management of lead poisoning. And the talk Dr. Bellinger will tell us is characterizing the public health impact of children's exposures to environmental chemicals. Please join me to welcome Professor Bellinger.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wu, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this symposium. Well, I would like to talk about some ideas about how we think about characterizing the impact of chemicals on children, and particularly on their brains. And it follows a bit up on the discussion just now about how we best communicate to politicians and legislators about these effects and why they should take them very, very seriously. So I'm going to talk about two issues. First, what is the best strategy for expressing on a quantitative basis the adverse effects of environmental chemicals on children's health and development at the population level, which I don't think we do enough of. And secondly, are we adequately conceptualizing the scope of the adverse effects that contribute to the total health burden associated with children's exposures to environmental chemicals? So let me take the first issue. Well, actually, before I do that, what I would like to argue is that the failure to apply an explicitly developmental perspective leads us to omit some critical adverse effects of early life exposures. And I'll address that when I talk about issue number 2. So the first issue is really one of risk communication. As I said, how do we communicate to stakeholders the results of the research that we accumulate showing that chemicals are not very good for children? So there are a number of ways that investigators do characterize or express the impact of chemicals on children at the population level. Sometimes people report the average impact. So they'll report a coefficient saying on average a child's IQ drops for half a point for each microgram per deciliter increase in blood lead level. That's basically a regression coefficient. Sometimes people do cost-benefit analyses of preventing or reducing exposure. So, for instance, with bisphenol A, there was a report recently that controlling children's exposures to this chemical would save about $3 billion a year. And in France, controlling lead would have a net benefit of about 2 billion euros per year. Another strategy that is increasingly being used to express the impact, and we've heard a little bit about it here, is to try to capture the aggregate impact of a chemical on quality of life, on mortality, morbidity, and express the WHO Global Burden of Disease, or GBD approach, is an example of an effort to express impact in this way. And I want to give you a little bit, for those of you who aren't familiar with the GBD approach, I want to walk you through the steps. So this is what I would call a disease-oriented approach. So burden accumulates if someone dies or they meet criteria for a disease. And in WHO's system, the outcome has to be a disease that has an ICD code. So the steps that are involved are first the diseases that are reasonably, where the causal attribution of a disease to an exposure is reasonably well, the conditions are met. There's good consensus that this disease is causally related to the exposure. The next step is to estimate the incidence of this disease in a population, and then come up with an estimate of the proportion of this disease incidence that's attributable to the exposure. So it's a population attributable fraction approach. And what WHO favors is a counterfactual approach. They say if this exposure was not present, what reduction would there be in the incidence of this disease? Then you have to determine the case fatality rate and the age at which people die from the disease. And this enables you to calculate the number of years of life lost due to this exposure, which is abbreviated YLL. And then also you have to determine the duration of the disease and its severity. So this enables you to calculate the number of years people live with this disease, and by assigning a disability weight, you can estimate the degree of disability, the severity of disability associated with the exposure. And this gives you years of life lived with disability, or YLL. And then you can just simply add, YLD. You can add the YLL and the YLD to get what is called the disability adjusted life years, or the DALYs. And you can do this by country or region, and then you can sum across all regions of the world to get the global DALYs. And that's the basis for the global burden of disease calculation. So I want to apply this system to methylmercury to show you what it leads to. So methylmercury exposure has been linked to a lot of different adverse effects in many organ systems, but the strongest evidence is for impaired cognitive development following prenatal exposure. And this is usually manifested as a decreased IQ score. So we have to figure out first, to estimate the burden of prenatal methylmercury, the dose-effect relationship. How much does IQ fall for an increase in exposure? So this is a paper that was done as part of, in the U.S., supporting the EPA's effort to control power plant emissions. And it was basically a pooled analysis of the three major prospective birth cohort studies on methylmercury. And the data from the three studies were put together, and it estimated a decline of 0.18 IQ points for each part per million increase in maternal hair mercury during pregnancy. Now, IQ loss is not a disease with an ICD code. So in order to fit this into a GBD approach, have to express it in terms of a disease. So in the GBD approach, the only thing that's considered to contribute to burden is when a child has an IQ score that, because of the IQ loss, results in mild intellectual disability, which is an IQ score below 70. So you'll see this slide refers to lead, but it's the same principle. This is the normal curve of IQ. And the GBD approach is only concerned with this tail, extreme lower tail of the distribution, and specifically how many children will be pushed into this region, this tail, as a result of methylmercury exposure. Now, ideally, you'd like to have a country or a region-specific IQ distribution, which would be used to make this calculation of how many children are in this tail, because the background prevalence of intellectual disability depends upon the prevalence of lots of other risk factors, which vary from one region to another. But unfortunately, we don't have good information about the IQ distribution in most countries, so we have to just assume it's the same distribution as in countries where it is available. So then we have to estimate the proportion of the population by country and region in each interval of hair mercury of women during pregnancy. And applying the dose effect relationship from the pooled studies, we can estimate the IQ loss for children whose mothers have a hair mercury level in one of these intervals. And we can use that to estimate the number of children who will end up in the tail, extreme left tail, with an IQ below 70. So I did this and found that the highest incidences of methylmercury-associated mild intellectual disability, which is an IQ between 50 and 70, were in these countries. And you'll see that one thing most of these countries have in common is that they're either island countries, or they have a very long coastline. And this fits with our idea that the way people typically get exposed to methylmercury is by consuming contaminated fish. And so this shows the incidence per 1,000 births in the country. In Antigua and Barbuda was the highest. And then we can also aggregate countries into WHO regions and estimate the incidence of intellectual disability by region, and go through the calculations that I mentioned in order to tally up the total number of DALYs. And what we see is that there's quite a variation, a low of 9,000 DALYs in region A of the Americas, up to the highest, which is the Western Pacific region, where we are now, where there's 226,000 DALYs. And although the incidence of methylmercury-associated intellectual disability is not the highest in this region, there's the large population countries, China, the Philippines, and Japan, are in this region. And so that's why we see the largest tally in that region. Now, my personal feeling is that the GBD approach is not very suitable for chemicals. And the reason is that health is not a dichotomy, but it's a continuum. And the clinical disease, as we saw yesterday in one of the slides, is only the tip of the iceberg. And if we focus only on the tip of the iceberg, we're going to miss a substantial portion of the burden, because it ignores the contributions to population burden that are made by people who don't meet the criteria for clinical disease. So in the last few years, I've been thinking about whether or not there's an alternative approach that seems to fit chemicals better than the GBD approach. And I took for inspiration some of the work that Jeffrey Rose, an epidemiologist from some decades ago, did, where he drew a contrast between individual and population risk. And he said that, and showed that most cases of disease don't arise from the upper tail of the distribution of values on some health index, but they arise from the middle of the distribution, because that's where most of the people are. And a famous quote from a paper of his 30 years ago is that a large number of people at a small risk may give rise to more cases of disease than a small number who are at high risk. And one implication of this is that among effect estimates, relative risk by itself can be very misleading in assessing risk at the population level. It's very useful in characterizing the risk faced by an individual, but it doesn't tell us much about risk at the population level, and I'll give you an illustration of that in a second. So this perspective implies that the burden attributable to a risk factor isn't fully captured by focusing solely on the extreme tails. That is, as I mentioned, the people who meet clinical criteria for disease. And to reduce total morbidity in the population, sometimes, not always, but sometimes it might be more effective to focus on exposure at this population level and shift the entire distribution of exposures, not just focus on reducing the number of people in the high-risk tail, because it's the, in Rose's term, it's the total dose of a risk factor to a population population that determines the burden associated with it. And the clearest example that I've come across of this is the relationship between the risk of Down syndrome and maternal age. So we know, it's very well known, that the women who are older at the time they give birth have a much higher incidence rate of births with Down syndrome. About a 50-fold difference between women who are older than 44 at the time of giving birth versus women who are younger than 30. So that's the relative risk of about 50 among older women. But we need to take into account how often women in different age intervals give birth. And the women who are younger are much more fertile. They give birth to many more children than to women who are older. So in fact, by combining the relative risk and the birth rate, the rate of giving birth, actually more than half of cases of Down syndrome occur to women who are under 30 years of age, and only 2% occur to women who are older than 44. Again, because of the big difference. Despite the big difference in relative risk, the difference in birth rate accounts for this. So if there were a chemical disease situation similar to this, we would do better to focus on this aspect of the equation rather than simply on the relative risk aspect. And this is not a new idea in epidemiology. It's been shown for a lot of different endpoints that the cutoffs we use to define clinical disease are just conveniences. They aren't necessarily the be-all and end-all of biology. So this is a collaborative study, I think has 1 million person-years of follow-up, that showed the relationship between ischemic heart disease mortality and systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And these are different age strata. People who are 80 to 89 and people who are under 50 years of age. But you can see that in all age strata, the relationship is quite coherent below the clinical cutoff value. So below systolic pressure of 140 or 145, whichever you use, there's nothing magic happens at that cutoff. In all age groups, the curves continue to decline, and the same below diastolic blood pressure of 90. So there is burden among people who are below these clinical cutoffs. Now, the same thing has been seen in studies of children's exposures to neurotoxicants. And this is a figure that we published more than 30 years ago, 1982, showing cumulative frequency distributions of children's verbal IQ stratified by tooth lead levels. Children were simply sorted into high tooth lead or low tooth lead, and these are the cumulative distributions. And you can see that we did in fact see that children exposed to high levels of lead, as reflected in their teeth, had a much higher frequency of IQ scores below 80. That was elevated threefold compared to children with low tooth leads. And the cumulative frequency distribution popped out at 100 much sooner for the high lead children. 5% of the low lead children had an IQ above 120, but none of the high lead children did. Now, in this, when we presented this figure, we focused only on the two extreme tails. And it's only in recent years I've gone back and said, hey, look, the curves never overlap. At all points along the distribution, the high lead children look worse than the low lead children. We need to take, and this is important, that the area under the curve, essentially, separating these two curves, is relevant from the standpoint of population burden. So the challenge that I set myself was to develop an approach that incorporates this concept of total dose to the population, not focusing solely on the most highly exposed individuals. And I wanted this approach to consider both the frequency of an exposure and its associated effect size, which in the case of a categorical diagnosis, it would be the mean impact on a case of this disease. or for exposures with continuous distributions that would be based on the dose-effect relationship. And I thought that this would allow the population burden attributable to a chemical to be compared to the burdens attributable to other risk factors, and maybe provide a stronger empirical basis for setting priorities for prevention and intervention. That is, identifying where our resources could be focused to produce a maximum societal benefit. So, I took as my focus the neurodevelopmental burden of risk factors in 0 to 5-year-old children in the United States. And as my endpoint, I chose full-scale IQ, not because I'm a neuropsychologist as well as an epidemiologist, and I don't think that full-scale IQ tells the whole story about a person, but it is the endpoint that's most commonly measured in studies, and so provides the best basis for comparison. So the data requirements for this analysis were an effect size that was ideally based on a meta-analysis or a pooled analysis of multiple studies of an exposure. You can always find a study that shows a very dramatic effect of some exposure, but I wanted to avoid the appearance of cherry-picking the most significant difference. And also it needed to have data on the distribution of the exposure in the population or the prevalence incidence of the risk factor. And I took as the population I was going to make reference to the 25.5 million children in the U.S. who are 0 to 5 years of age. So let me just give you one example of the kind of calculation I did. This is for traumatic brain injury in children. So among 0 to 14-year-olds in the U.S., annually there are about 475,000 traumatic brain injuries. Now, I couldn't find data specifically on 0 to 5-year-olds, but I assumed that 1/3 of the events occur in this age range, which is 1/3 of the 0 to 14 range. And so these are annual cases. So for a 5-year cohort, this is about 800,000 cases. Now, in this meta-analysis I found, they determined from the literature that about 80% of cases are mild, based on the Glasgow-Coma scale, 10% are moderate in severity, and 10% are severe. And that these are the IQ losses associated with mild, moderate, and severe traumatic brain injury. So if we combine these effect estimates with the assumed frequency of mild, moderate, and severe brain injury, we can calculate the total number of IQ points lost as a result of these 3 grades of traumatic brain injury, and total them up, and we get about 5 million points. Now, doing this, you can get what look to be very precise numbers, but these are very uncertain, and I would say just interpret this as about 5 million points total IQ loss. So I did this calculation for as many common pediatric, relatively common pediatric conditions and events as I could find, and ranging from about 37,000 IQ points lost in a 0 to 5 child cohort for brain tumors, up to about 3 orders of magnitude higher, 34 million for preterm birth, and covering the whole range in between. So having a brain tumor is a very significant event for a child and their family, but fortunately they're quite rare. So at a population level, they aren't considered much in terms of total IQ points lost. Whereas preterm birth affects about 12% of children and is associated with about 3/4 of a standard deviation loss in IQ. So putting those two together, you get a very big number. So I went through this process with chemicals. So I did it for 3. Methylmercury exposure, organic phosphate pesticides, and lead. So for mercury, I got the distribution of maternal hair lead levels by looking in the NHANES survey and looking at the U.S. women of childbearing age, not necessarily pregnant, but of childbearing age. And these are the values at different deciles. And I used an updated estimate of the dose-effect relationship from some new studies from Philippe Grandjean. And I So combining the dose effect estimate with the distributional numbers, I got a total IQ loss of about 1.4 million IQ points. Did the same thing for organophosphate pesticides. There was no meta-analysis, but there were 2 birth cohort prospective studies on prenatal that measured prenatal urinary dialkyl phosphate metabolites, or DAP levels, in mothers who were enrolled in the birth cohort studies. And in these studies, children were followed up to childhood, and IQ was assessed. So the I weighted the effect size by the sample size in the 2 studies. And the weighted effect size over a range of 50 to 500 nanomoles per liter was this loss of IQ points per nanomole per liter of DAP level. So over this entire range of 50 to 500, a loss of about 6 IQ points. Now I looked in NHANES to see the maternal, the DAP levels in women of childbearing age, and the median was 65, and the 95th percentile was almost 500. So actually not a bad match to this 50 to 500 nanomoles per liter. So again, combining the exposure distribution and the dose effect relationship, I estimated about 19 million IQ points lost among U.S. children as a result of pesticide exposure. So I did the same thing with lead. Got the blood lead distribution for children 1 to 5 years from NHANES. The dose effect assumptions came from a pooled analysis of 7 international prospective studies. And the slope over the range of 2.4 to 10 micrograms per deciliter was a loss of about half an IQ point per microgram per deciliter. This strange lower bound was because only 5% of the children in the combined cohorts had a level below 2.4. And there's a feeling that was a little unstable for estimation. But it seems to be widely agreed nowadays that there is no threshold for the adverse effects of lead, so it seems to be reasonable to assume the same slope holding in the range of 0 to 2.4 micrograms per deciliter. And then from the Lanfear pooled analysis, there was a loss of about 0.2 IQ points per microgram per deciliter over the range of 10 to 20 micrograms per deciliter. So I assume that for children with a blood lead greater than 10, there was a mean of 15 micrograms per deciliter, and the average IQ loss was 5.1 points lost, plus 1 point. 5.1 for going from 0 to 10, and another 1 for going from 10 to 20, for a total of 6.1 points. So then I went through the calculations for children in different blood lead intervals. So half the children were in this 0 to 1.4 micrograms per deciliter. So half of the 25.5 million children. So multiplying that by the midpoint of the interval by the slope, got this total number of IQ points lost. And I did this for all of these categories, coming up with a total loss of about 23 million IQ points lost as a result of lead. And what's interesting, and I think validated Rose's comments, was that more than 10 million of these points were among the children who had the lowest blood lead level. So each child was not suffering much of an IQ loss, but there are so many children in those intervals, 75% of the children, that they each contribute a little bit to the total loss, and accounted for almost half of this total loss in the population. It certainly wasn't only the children who have a level that we consider as clinically significant these days. So if we put these 3 chemicals into the table of other pediatric events and health conditions, we see that they're surprisingly important contributors to the overall IQ loss in the population. Whereas if we did a GBD approach, we would only be focusing on the children who had an IQ below 70. What we've seen is that there's a lot of burden among children who are in the normal range of IQ. So I think this kind of approach has a lot of utility. It could be useful for risk prioritization. So for exposures for which knowledge is limited, and I would say that the brominated flame retardants and bisphenol A, doing this kind of assessment as range finding to get an idea of whether these are really likely to be important at the population level would be useful in deciding which chemicals to focus on. Of course, acknowledging that early studies of the risk factor very often report larger effect sizes for a number of reasons than later studies, so we have to be a little bit careful. We can also use it to estimate the impact of interventions to reduce exposure or the cost of not intervening. So I did this same calculation using, as for the exposure distribution, the NHANES-2 blood lead distribution, where the mean blood lead level of U.S. children was about 15 micrograms per deciliter, and 88% of children had a level above 10 micrograms per deciliter. And using that exposure distribution, I calculated that 0 to 5-year-old children were losing almost 120 million IQ points, which means that the efforts that have been taken in the last 30 years to reduce children's exposures to lead have saved about 100 million points among U.S. children. So it seems to me useful from that standpoint. And it's also could be used to conduct cross-setting comparisons of the relative importance of an exposure in different regions of the world. So I did a comparative analysis for methylmercury for the U.S., Japan, and Brazil. And the only way you can do this is to calculate a per capita impact of the chemical. And for U.S. children, the impact was not very big, only about 0.05 IQ points per child. And that's because in the U.S. we don't eat much fish. And so it's not a very significant contributor. In Japan, the per capita estimate was 10-fold higher, about 0.6 points per child. And in Brazil, among children who are living in areas where artisanal gold mining is being done, which leads to very heavy contamination of local water bodies, the impact was 100-fold higher per child than in the U.S. and 10-fold higher in Japan. So clearly suggests that this is a big contributor to the children who are affected by this environmental contamination. Okay, so that's the first part I was going to talk about, the how to express quantitatively the impact of chemicals. And more briefly, I'm going to talk about two elements of a developmental perspective that I don't think are routinely incorporated in our thinking about chemicals, but really are an important part of the big picture. That is that deficits caused by early life exposure can initiate developmental cascades, and they can result in late pathologies that differ from those initially observed. And second, that early life exposures become part of the context in which all subsequent development unfolds. And while we often ask what factors modify the toxicity of a child's exposure to a chemical, we don't ask, does the fact that a child was exposed to a chemical in early life, does that affect the way the child responds to later events and exposures, or their ability to be resilient in the face of later stresses, perhaps non-chemical stresses? So let me talk about this issue of developmental cascade. So again, that's where the late outcomes differ from the near-term outcomes. And also that an early exposure can reduce CNS reserve capacity, accelerating neurodegenerative processes associated with normal aging or aggravating the adverse effects of later neurological insults. And one possible mechanism here is what Dr. Vandenhagel mentioned about epigenetic changes that are expressed as altered gene expression, but only in adulthood. They're silent. They're latent until adulthood, so we don't see any impact until situations are right for them to be expressed. And we're left with epigenetic marks that have been likened to tombstones of previous exposures that there may not be any lingering evidence of. The biomarkers may not indicate that early exposure anymore, but nevertheless the result is left in the patterns of DNA expression. So let me give you one example of what I think is a developmental cascade, and that's the relationship between lead and propensity to engage in criminal activity. There are several studies now that have indicated this, and I think the strongest is from the prospective lead study done in Cincinnati, which was a birth cohort study where they had very good information about lifetime history to lead and collected well before the information on crime. What they did was to go to administrative records of the county in which Cincinnati is located and find out which children had been arrested and how many times. And then they looked back to see whether or not the blood lead levels of the children up to 20 years earlier predicted that the number of times the child had been arrested, adjusting for maternal IQ and quality of the home environment and nutrition and all the things that need to be controlled in lead studies. And in fact, they did find, this is the adjusted rate ratio for each 5 micrograms per deciliter increment in blood lead. They did find for blood lead during different epochs, prenatally or during childhood or even just at 6 years of age, significant rate ratios indicating that the children who had been more highly exposed as children were more likely to have run afoul of the law 20 years later. Now, some people have looked at this finding and said, well, that's crazy. There's no lead center in the brain that lead is injuring, and this is hard to believe that childhood lead exposure could lead to crime 20 years later. But in my view, if you look at it in a developmental perspective, it starts to make some more sense. So we do know from many studies that lead is associated with a lot of neuropsychological deficits, such as reduced IQ, reduced ability to sustain attention, what's called executive dysfunction, which is manifested as poor impulse control, cognitive inflexibility, inability to delay gratification, reduced ability to formulate and implement long-term strategies and modify them in response to feedback. Also, we know that children who are more highly exposed do less well in school, and they're less likely to complete school, and they're at higher risk of behavioral disorders such as ADHD and conduct disorder. So as we think about a child who's been exposed to lead, they have these different outcomes, adverse outcomes in childhood, which lead to problems achieving in school and behavior problems. It may lead them to make poor choices. They don't have a lot of good employment opportunities. They may engage in more substance abuse. They have more injuries. May find other things to do with their time than academics that are not so healthy, and may result in more criminal activity. Now, this certainly doesn't happen for all children who are exposed to lead. Each of these transitions is probabilistic, and there's only some children who are going to end up here. And I think from the standpoint of intervention and prevention, if we could identify what are the factors that promote this transition from here to here and here to here and here to here, this is where we might be able to intervene and to reduce the number of children who end up down in this box. Now, in terms of early life exposure and aging-related processes, there have been mostly animal studies at this point looking at early life lead exposure and the risk of neurodegeneration that looks a lot like Alzheimer's disease. So, of course, the two characteristic lesions of Alzheimer's disease are the extracellular deposition of beta amyloid proteins forming the plaques that are diagnostic of Alzheimer's, and also the intracellular deposition of the hyperphosphorylated tau protein. These are the neurofibrillary tangles. Now, in rodents, Zawiya and his colleagues have shown that at 20 months, which is adult for a rat, rats who had been exposed to lead only as newborns and not afterwards showed delayed overexpression of the gene encoding the beta amyloid precursor protein, or APP. And this increase in the gene expression was accompanied by an elevation of beta amyloid protein in the brain. And these changes were not seen in rats who had been exposed to lead only as adults. It was clearly a developmental phenomenon that was silent until the rats reached adulthood. This has also been shown now in monkeys, 23-year-old monkeys after developmental exposure to lead. And they found increased mRNA expression of the APP, amyloid precursor protein, in the lead-exposed versus the control rats. Increased expression of this cleaving enzyme, a beta site, ATP. And in this SP1, a transcriptional regulator in the frontal cortex, which we know is a very vulnerable place for lead exposure. There were also the dense core plaques rich in these AB proteins, especially the most amyloidogenic species. There was a reduction in DNA methyltransferase, suggesting that it really was an epigenetic effect, and higher levels of biomarkers of oxidative DNA damage. So we don't know whether this is happening in humans, but given that now children who had been most exposed to lead back in the 1940s and 50s are reaching old age, I think this is something that we really need to understand. And the final issue I want to talk about was early life lead exposure as a risk, or early life chemical exposure, again an example from lead, as a risk modifier of later insults. So this is a study in which two groups of rats were studied. One was exposed to lead as infants and the other was not. And then both groups were exposed to a laser that produced a thrombus, a thrombotic stroke in the hind limb parietal sensory motor cortex in adulthood. So this is when at day 0 is when the stroke was induced. So before the stroke, there was no difference between the two groups in terms of the number of errors they made in beam walking. And there was no difference in between the groups in their proprioceptive limb placing. So the early lead exposure didn't have any impact on these adult outcomes. But look what happened after the stroke. The lead-exposed rats, these solid squares, made many more errors than the group that had, the placebo group that had not been exposed to any lead in terms of their beam walking. And similarly, they made more, they had lower ratings, quality of movement ratings on the limb beam walking than the controls. So somehow the early lead exposure had primed these animals to be more vulnerable to this later stress, made them less able to get by it, to weather that insult. Another example is early lead exposure and development of these columnar processing units in the barrel field cortex, portion of the neocortex. So early life lead exposure was associated with a dose-related reduction in the area of the barrel field cortex, a reduction of about 12%. Although the total cortical area in the same sections was not significantly different, it was a very specific effect to this particular part of the cortex. And then the investigators did the whisker ablation, basically just cut the whiskers of the two groups of animals. And they looked to see that disturbs the connections between cells in the barrel field cortex and the sensory cells at the whiskers. And the lead exposure, in a normal rat, the barrel field cells and the whisker cells will hook back up fairly efficiently in the way that they're supposed to. But the early lead exposed animals had impaired reorganization of this cortical area. And what was left were clusters of denervated neurons that were firing, they were active, but they weren't connected up in the way that they were supposed to be connected up. And so this would impair what is a very important function for rats. This is the primary way in which they sense their environment, is through their whiskers. So this is not a problem of a morbidity without impact. So in conclusion, in my view, the estimation of the population impact of early life exposure should not be based on a single endpoint such as IQ. IQ is important, but what's important is what happens after somebody has an impaired IQ. We can't view it in isolation as independent and as unchanging. It has downstream cumulative effects in many areas of function. We need to catalog those areas. And similarly, we can't focus just on clinically defined outcomes. There's a lot of the burden, maybe most of it, is associated with subclinical impacts. and it will underestimate the burden if we focus only on clinically defined outcomes. And exposure-related adversities that are evident in childhood reflect only the earliest stages of their unfolding, and a full accounting requires that we take what's called a lifespan developmental perspective, and we include outcomes along this probabilistic cascade of events that begin with this early life exposure. And finally, we have to include morbidities that early life exposure to a chemical contribute to as a risk modifier, forming part of the context that determines the impacts of these later pathologic and even physiologic and normal aging CNS events. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Bellinger, for such a wonderful talk, showing with us the alternate approach to look at the epigenetic inference. And it's also the supervisor from we might have the time for one or two questions and comments from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you for your very inspiring talk. I'm Lucas Lee from NHR. I'm a clinical neurologist. And I'm wondering if you identify some mental-associated mental impairment. Could you provide some effective intervention to improve the populational, I mean the child mental capacity is the nation's future hope. So do you have any suggestion?
It's really remarkable that there's no published intervention study on chemical exposures in children. Typically what has happened is that children present in school with a learning difficulty, and very often the school officials don't know the child may have been exposed to some toxicant. And so the children are just treated as like a garden variety learning disability, and which may be enough. I mean, it's not clear that knowing that a disability was due to mercury or to lead exposure in the first year or two of life, producing difficulty at age 7. It's not clear that knowing the chemical etiology would have any impact, because you wouldn't do anything. There may be no evidence remaining of that increased exposure. And so, as a neuropsychologist, I think the best strategy would be to follow the normal procedure of evaluate the child's strengths and weaknesses and figure out how to help the child use the strengths in order to get around the weaknesses, which is done, that's what's done routinely for children who present with learning difficulties. I think there's probably nothing specific to a chemical etiology that would change that.
Actually, recently, I saw two young people. They are aged about 22. I measure one of them the high level of metal in their cerebral spinal fluids. Do you have any experience concerning the biomarker in CSF?
No, it's certainly not a biomarker that's routinely used. And I don't know that I've seen any papers providing normal ranges. Not that there is a normal range for chemicals, but there is what's considered an acceptable range. So I think that would be measured only under, if there's increased cranial pressure and you have some reason to do that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. It's kind of this argument for accumulating the impact in a way that gives more weight to the smaller impacts in the larger part of the population that only has a low exposure has an appeal, but I still I'm still not entirely convinced, because most of those aggregate IQ millions of decrements are coming from the center of the distribution. So it's for people whose IQ is on average falling from 104 to 103 or 92 to 91. And I'm just wondering whether in those small shifts in the normal range, whether there is really a societal impact that you can quantify in terms of dollars of, because people work more slowly or they make decisions more slowly or something.
Well, economists do quantify, and I think that
economists make mistakes. That's not
sure.
That's not proof. That's
yeah,
not
well,
proof of
you asked whether could quantify. They say $17,000 in lifetime earnings for each is lost for each IQ point.
Based on the shift or on the basis of the assumption of an increased proportion of people with MMR or MID?
No, that's in the normal range. And it's based on just large samples where the people correlated IQ with lifetime earnings. Yeah, it's a good point. It's easier to understand why doubling or tripling the number of people with an IQ below 70 or halving the number of people with an IQ above 120 might have some societal significance. But I just can't believe that it's immaterial that that everybody loses a little bit, that there isn't some impact. To be honest, I don't know quite how to capture that, to demonstrate that impact, but it just seems to me that it's undesirable. And again, it might not be IQ that is the most critical endpoint. If people are losing the ability to anticipate consequences and to plan for the future, which is harder to quantify, I think that might be, in terms of individual quality of life and eventual achievement, that might be the more important endpoint.